Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states have a new reason to be concerned about their Russian neighbor, on top of all the other reasons that they're concerned about their Russian neighbor, including the largest war in Europe since World War II, the Russian government questioning the independence and legitimacy of post-Soviet states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that used to be part of the Russian Empire, and all sorts of other ideological gibberish that is coming from the Kremlin towards the Baltic states about their semi, or you could say pseudo-independence, as the Russian intellectual elite treats their independence and their sovereignty more like a recommendation than a command or statement of fact that these are nations that are independent. The same way that they've treated Ukraine like that for decades, and now they've asserted that claim in actuality. And so if you're Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and you see Vladimir Putin open the war with a speech that not only called into question Ukrainian sovereignty, but their sovereignty, that's going to be very concerning. When you see legislation introduced into the Russian parliament, calling into question their acknowledgement of Russia's acknowledgement of Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian independence, that is very concerning. The Russians moving nuclear weapons into the region, into locations like Belarus, that is concerning. The different GPS jamming that the Russian government has been doing in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which has been so bad that Finnish airliners have diverted their flights from the country, that is concerning. The cutting of communication cables between Estonia and Finland by ship anchors that is suspiciously in favor of Russian interests, that is concerning. The targeting of drone facilities and suspicious arson attacks. There's many things, many things that have the Baltic states worried. But now they have one more reason, as that concern about Russia's belief in their sovereignty and independence is shaken more by the Russians.
Ohak has donated $20. Grum is a big smelly loser and I'd outsmoke him any day.
Thank you so much for the $20. I really appreciate that, buddy. You could have given that $20 to anybody, but you're giving it to me. So the first reason why this, is starting to concern the Baltic states again is because of a statement that was put out by the Russian Ministry of Defense online. And it had to do with them no longer recognizing the current maritime borders between the Russian Federation and different Baltic states, like, for example, Estonia, and said that these had to be readjusted because the reality since 1985, when this was, recalibrated, has changed significantly. In fact, I think we can read the exact statement from the Russian government. In a draft proposal reported by some Russian media, Russia's defense ministry suggested updating the coordinates used to measure the strip of territorial water off its mainland coast and that of its islands in the Baltic Sea. The existing coordinates were approved in 1985, the ministry says, adding that they were, and I quote, based on small-scale nautical and navigation maps and don't correspond to the, and I quote, modern geographical situation. Now that is unbelievably vague. That's very sanitized language. But what you could boil it down from the Baltic perspective is times have changed. It's not 1985 anymore when the Soviet Union was still together. Times have changed. We don't like the current territorial water divide, and it doesn't match up to the current geographical situation or geopolitical situation, as in the Russians want more territorial waters. That is what anybody would implicitly assume from the sanitized language. Now, it's hard to make implicit assumptions because a lot of times when you engage in this type of public diplomacy, your hope is that your opponent understands what you're saying. Your opponent understands what you're trying to get at so they can act or react accordingly. If you're trying to deter them from doing something, or you're trying to you're trying to get them trying to make them do something. You're trying to, what's the word? Compulsion. It starts with a C. You're trying to compulse them, not the word. You're trying to make them do something. Coerce. You're trying to coerce them into doing something. That wasn't the word I was looking for, but it's close enough. Compel. Compel them into something. Compellence is different than deterrence. Either way, the Russian government, from the Baltic perspective, believes that the current lineup of these maps is no bueno, and they've sanitized the language, which, while might make it sound less concerning, if you remember, special military operation sounded very sanitized as well. And the reasons that seemed ridiculous at the time for starting a war, Nazis. You're going in to fight Nazis? You're gonna use Rusich, the neo-Nazi battalion, to go fight and get rid of that? Yeah, sure, buddy. I mean, it sounds silly, the idea that they need to unilaterally change the nautical maps because the modern geographical situation has changed. I don't even know what that means. Like, the water's not changed, the land's not changed. So what does it mean? It must mean that the geopolitical situation has changed, which is leading Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, but especially Estonians, because if you look at the Estonia territorial waters, now, if you see this red line, this is the exclusive economic zone. So this is the area that Estonians can engage in economic activity like fishing. And the blue line is their territorial waters, which is what Russia would be challenging. Estonia is the one that's closest to the Russians and would be closest to any Russian naval mission that would be trying to challenge the territorial waters. So obviously there's a lot of concern from these countries. Now, this type of signaling put a lot of concern in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And so what does the Russian government do to assuage these concerns, to signal that don't worry about it? Well, nothing outside of deleting the post that they made. So the Russian Defense Ministry seemingly didn't announce that they were retracting their statement. It seemed as if they were just pretending they never made the statement to begin with. Now, that might seem like pretty sucky propaganda if you put out a government statement challenging the territorial waters of another country, and then within 24 hours, you go around deleting it as if you were tweeting drunk in the middle of the night. But there's also been other instances of this war as well, of this happening in this war as well. At the start of the war, there was Russian state media that, right when the war started, talked about how it's good that Ukraine's being destroyed because Ukraine is an artificial entity and it is an extension of Russia and it must be annihilated and destroyed for Nazism to truly be challenged. And it was deleted a few days later after the war did not go as swimmingly, and it started to give them a lot of bad press. Now, the reasons behind that and them deleting this could be different. It could be that they got the message out there, so now they wanted to delete it to try to bring less attention to it, but they still wanted to posture in this way. It could be that they didn't get the reaction that they wanted. It could be that they just want to do semi-signaling and then reel it back. Who knows? It's impossible to say, but this isn't the first time that the Russian government or a Russian state enterprise in some capacity, even though the other instance was state media, comes out, makes a statement, it's very provocative, and then they just delete it with no word. And when Peskov was asked about this getting deleted and asked about, are you going to challenge the territorial waters? He just told them to go talk to the defense ministry. So he avoided the question and kept it vague. So sanitized language, vague reasons for aggression, based upon historical grievances surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union and the changing geographical situation. I'm sorry, there hasn't been a massive earthquake in Estonia, cutting it in half. Don't know what that could refer to outside of geopolitical changes. All of this created a lot of concern in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that was where the story ended. Just concern, something to look at for the future. That's where we left the story off yesterday. But now the story is getting more concerning, because Estonian authorities are saying that the Russian border guards dividing their two countries are removing river border markers from Estonian territory. They're removing border markers between Russia and Estonia after making claims to their territorial waters, and then deleting said claims right after. Well, if that doesn't make you concerned, I don't know what will. Let's read a little bit about it. Estonia's police and border guard said on May 23rd that Russian border guards removed the boundary markers from the Narva River that separates Russian and Estonian territory. The incident follows a Russian decree suggesting that Russia's maritime borders in the Baltic Sea be unilaterally changed. Which, by the way, again, that means they wouldn't discuss it with Estonia. They wouldn't discuss it with these other countries. It means Russia would simply go in there, take it, and then everybody else would just have to live with it. The decree was subsequently removed from the government's website without an explanation, following swift condemnation from some NATO members. Eric Pergel, head of the PPA's Eastern Prefecture, said that Estonia and Russian authorities installed the buoys that separate the territories on a yearly basis in order to ease navigation on the river and prevent fishermen and others from accidentally straying across the border. The retrospective authorities agreed on the buoy's location in 2022, but then Russia backtracked and disputed the placement of more than half of 250 markers. Russian border guards then unilaterally began removing them on May 23rd without providing an explanation for their actions. The PPA will contact the Russian border guard and request clarifications on the removal of the buoys and the return of buoys. The PPA expects evidence from Russia that the position of the shipping route agreed so far has changed, and if they are so not presented, we will continue to install the buoys. Prime Minister Kardar Kallas characterized it as a border incident and said it was being investigated. We will approach this case in a sober, balanced way, engaging with allies where necessary. We see a broader pattern of Russian actions trying to sow anxiety in Lithuanian society. Estonia began nightly closures of the crossing between Narva and the Russian border city earlier in May. So this is the disintegration of border markers separating the Russian and Estonian borders along the river. Now, if you want to get an idea of where that might be, this is where it is. You see this river right here? This red line right here is the dividing line between Estonia and Russia. And this lake, that other lake up there, this river down here into Lake Peskov, which also travels down into Latvia, this is a river that goes through multiple countries, through Estonia and Latvia. So this is not only a concern to Estonia, something like this very well could spread to Latvia. But as you can see here, more than half of the border with Russia, if not, maybe not more than half, but roughly half of the border with Russia is made up of waterways, if not more than half of the border is made up of waterways, river, if not the entirety of it. So if almost the entirety of the border is covered in waterways and rivers, challenging specifically the sovereignty of their territorial waters instead of necessarily the land territory could maybe be a less, or seen as a less escalatory way to challenge Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian, but primarily right now, because that's the border markers that are being destroyed and taken down, Estonian. This right here is everything that Ukraine's biggest European defenders have been warning against, saying that if the West does not defend Ukraine and make the Russians believe that they will pay a penalty for territorial aggression upon its neighbors, then they will simply believe that they have been rewarded for their behavior, they've been rewarded for their determination in trying to see through the war, and they will move on to another country. Because if NATO won't defend a country of 44 million people, would NATO, under Donald Trump, who's suggested that Russia should invade NATO allies, even if just to try to drain them of more dollars into their defense budgets, would they be willing to start a war over Estonia's territorial waters? And if they're not willing to start a war over the Gulf of Finland, maybe they're not willing to start a war over Lake Peipus. Maybe they're not willing to start a war over Lake Pskov or the river that divides their territory. Maybe they're not willing to start a war over GPS jamming and other provocations against these countries. Then maybe we can extend it into what they're extending it into now, territorial claims. And just because it's their territorial waters doesn't make it any less serious. I mean, the South China Sea is one of the biggest geopolitical issues and hot points in the world. And so when people talk about like potential World War III scenarios or potential scenarios where another big war breaks out, the two locations I'll hear about the most is the India-Pakistan border over Kashmir or the South China Sea. So territorial waters are important, especially if you're talking about such strategically important areas which have already been clearly demarcated, and Russia is eliminated those demarcations, is eliminated those territorial claims completely unilaterally, meaning there's been no discussion with the government in Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, no discussion with NATO officials, no discussion with the United States, no discussion with European Union officials, no discussion with any international body. It is Russia purely deciding on its own terms, I don't believe you own that water anymore. It's ours. Why? Geographical changes. What geographical changes? Stop asking questions. The Soviet Union collapsed. This is everything that Ukraine's backers have warned about, that Russia would be encouraged to keep encroaching. Now, somebody could say that, well, this is just the territorial waters. That doesn't necessarily extend into conquering Estonia, or that doesn't necessarily extend into provocations into locations like Navra or into other Russian-speaking portions of Estonia that have large amount of Russian-speaking populations. And Russia has invaded many countries, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and others, under the claim that they had to defend Russian speakers, and they could probably do it again in the Baltic states. Now, you could say that it's going to be limited, that the Russians are going to hold it back, that this is just a little bit of provocation to try to make them back off. But on the other hand, if you look at it from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania's perspective, if Russia wanted to show that their territorial ambitions did not stop at Ukraine, while also staying outside the bounds of a war, at least for now, it would be through actions like this, where they're still challenging the territorial independence unilaterally, doing it in the waters where they're going to be much less likely to open fire because, you know, where exactly on those nautical maps does the territory start and end is going to be maybe more of a question mark when they're engaging on the high seas than if they cross a clearly demarcated checkpoint. And so I think that this is the Russians probing. I think this is an example of the Russians trying to see what they can get away with now that they've invaded Ukraine and now that they've moved nukes into the region and they saw American aid fall off for 6 months. Now, whether one caused the other, one was many factors that led to the other, it's hard to say. But if anybody is under the assumption that we can implicitly assume, either due to presumptions of Russian weakness or presumptions about Russian priorities, that their territorial claims stop at Ukraine, that's naive. Oh, and here's a picture of it, by the way, if you guys were curious to what it looked like when they took down the border demarcating buoys. This is it right here. So it's not deep state news, man. It's clearly shown, photographed. This type of stuff is legitimately scary, man. Legitimately. Because I can see how this can easily spiral into another border crisis.